What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today what I'm going to do is I'm doing a little how-to video, and in my last ride I noticed that my little cup there has split from the axle, which ruined the axle. Everything inside there got water in there, so when I was riding it I heard it clicking and clattering and I knew something was not right. So I went and got an axle from my local place. Make very good products, better than OEM. It's for ATV and UTV products, and it's a direct replacement. So I'm going to do a how-to on how to replace this bearing, or I'm sorry, this axle, as well as the wheel bearing in the hub, because that is bad too. So let's get started. Okay, the first thing you want to do is you want to loosen your lug nuts up while the machine is still on the ground, because this will allow the wheel to not spin when you're trying to undo these. So let's get that loosened up. Okay, now that we have this loosened up, let's get the bike in the air so that we can finish taking them off and get the wheel off the machine. Okay, it's up in the air. You can see it free spins. So now what we want to do is take our wheel nuts all the way off. Okay, now that we have the wheel nuts all the way off, we can remove the wheel, sit this off to the side. And now what we need to do is we need to get this cap off so we can get to the wheel or axle nut behind it. Now this can be tricky. If you get impatient, you can break the little tabs off that hold this on. So I suggest just getting a small, fine flathead screwdriver or something fine. If you get in here and just kind of press these knobs down to pull this out. So let's go ahead and do that now. Alright, so I found a screwdriver that'll work. Just get in here, pry these out best you can without breaking the tabs or breaking your screwdriver. And then it'll pull right out. See, it's got these tabs in here, so if you go yanking on that or try prying, you could bust that off and then this would be useless. So now we have the axle nut right here. There's a cotter pin that runs down. You'll want to take that cotter pin out before trying to get the nut off. Once you get that cotter pin out, we then want to take this nut off like so. Okay, so now that we have the axle nut off, we need to get the caliper off the rotor so that we can remove this hub to get to the actual axle. It's very simple. There are two bolts back here, one right here and one right here. You just loosen them up and take them out and the caliper will slide off. Now we don't have to disconnect the hose because we're just going to move the caliper off to the side and out of the way. So do not remove the hose, otherwise you're going to have to go through bleeding the brake system, and that can be a chore sometimes. So let's get those off. One. Two. Set them off to the side, and now your caliper should just slide off your rotor, and it can hang right there, or you can put it up and brace it up there for now to keep it up out of the way. So now we got to disconnect this as well as this down here and this here to be able to get this whole hub off. If you want to replace the bearing, since we have to do that, that's what I'm going to do. Now with the lock nut off, this should just pull right off with no problem. And there's a washer there. Make sure you keep that, sit that off to the side. And here's your bearing right here. This is what we need to pull out and replace. So let's go ahead and get this loosened up and get this loosened up as well as this. And let's get the hub off. Might take a little bit of moving around to get that lined up enough so you can get that out. We may have to take the shock off first. That'll allow less tension on here so we can move this up and down to allow this to come out. So let's go ahead and remove the shock. It's one bolt there and one bolt up there, and we'll pull that out. I did try to take just this bolt out and moving this shock up out of the way, but there's not enough clearance up here for it to pivot out of the way. So you have to remove the whole shock. I found it easier to remove the whole shock. That way this whole arm can come up and you can move it, and that way it gives you more access to getting to these parts and stuff. So let's get this shock off. And I'll sit that up here on top. All right, so now that we have the shock out of the way, this arm can now freely move up and down because there's no tension from the shock. So because of that, this can now get to a spot where it should just pull out just like that. Boom, easy. You got a washer on top and there's a washer on the bottom when you take that nut off too. So don't lose the washers, set them off to the side. There's also another cotter pin that will be in here, so you want to make sure you don't lose that. Get that cotter pin out before trying to take that nut off and put that somewhere safe. I've already had it off before starting, so it's off in the safe place. To be able to get this out, you need to remove this bolt. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so now that we have this bolt out, we need to get this out, and it's going to take a little bit of finagling. It should just pop right out. Actually, may take a little bit of hammer job. Pop it out just like that, and now we can get to the axle. So now we can lift this up. Let's get this up and out of the way so it doesn't get messed up. Maybe like so. This can now pull right out of there like that. Okay, now once you have it out of this, all you have to do is give it a good yank. There's a cotter pin that's keeping this side of the axle in, so you just need to kind of do a good yank and yank on that, and she'll pull right out of there, no problem. Like that. And there it is. Now with the axle out, let's get the rest of this off so we can get all right. Washer and nut. There will also be another cotter pin in this hole right here. Make sure you don't lose that. Taking it out, put it somewhere safe like I have already, and then that's it. There'll be a bearing ring in here. Keep the bearing in there nice and sturdy. You'll pull that out, and then you'll have to have this bearing pressed out. Once you have the bearing pressed out, you get your new bearing and have it pressed in, and it's good to go. I've already done that, so this is the good bearing in here. So now let's put everything back together. So you have your axle. You're going to take the thick side. Thick side is going to go back in, and you want to do a good push. There you go, good push. That'll lock it in. It's now locked in, won't come out. And we can just reverse everything we did to put this all back together. If you weren't replacing the bearing, then you really wouldn't need to take all this off right here, and this would be able to move, and you could put everything back together without actually taking this off. But because we had to change the bearing, that's why I did this with taking it off. Now you don't want to put the axle back in and then try to put this all back together. Why? Because you won't be able, well, you will be able to, but it'll make it very difficult to get a wrench in there and do little itty bitty quarter turns. It'll take you forever to tighten that up. Easiest thing is put this back on first, and then we can get the axle in. So let's get this back on. All right, now once you got this back on, don't forget to throw your cotter pin back in there. All right, once we have the cotter pin in, now we can put the axle in. So we want to get this up here, get the angle right, put that back in there and slide it back down. Boom, axle's in. Now we can take our tie rod, get that on there. Oop, don't forget your washer on the top. When tightening this up, if this starts to spin on top, just take another wrench, which happens to be a 15. That way we can get a good tight finish there. Now put your cotter pin back in this one as well. All right, cotter pin on. Now we can get this one on. And this one may be a little fun to get back in, because what you're going to have to do is you're probably going to want to put the shock back on first before we put this one on, because that will allow us to keep this from moving, because you're probably going to want to maybe hit this with a hammer a few times to get it back into place. So let's go ahead and put our shock back on. Okay, now with the shock back on, we can go ahead and put the lower arm back into the hub. Now when you put the bolt back through, there's a little notch on this pin that you got to line that bolt up with that notch. This is where I said it could take a little while. It happened to slide right in, and just put a little pressure on that. The bolts slide right in. Put the nut back on it, and you're ready to go. Once this is nice and tight, we can put our hub back on with our rotor. Slide that back on like this. So we got the hub back on, put our washer back on, put our axle nut back on, and I'm just going to put this on hand tight for now, because we're going to need to put the wheel back on so that we can put tension on this to torque this down to what it needs to be. Otherwise, the wheel's just going to spin. So now that we have that somewhat on, we can apply the caliper back. This would also be a good time to check your brake pads. Make sure they're not low and need to replace. Get your caliper bolts back in. Sure they're nice and snug. Test, they're good. So now what we're going to do is we're going to put the wheel back on temporarily so that we can torque this down. So it's a little bit of a process, because you can't torque this nut down with it up in the air like this, because what's going to happen is this is just going to spin. So let's go ahead and get the wheel on. Okay, now that the wheel's on, I'm going to release the jack and bring the pressure down so that I can put the torque necessary for that axle nut. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, we got the jack lowered. you're going to need your, what is this, a 27 millimeter is what this requires. 27 millimeter socket. I got my torque wrench here. You want to set your settings to 150 pounds. That's what the OEM spec is for this axle nut on this Can Am Outlander. So let's go ahead and tighten her down. Torque down to the spec, and we can get our cotter pin back in. Let's throw our cotter pin back in. Might need a little help. That's in there. Now we can take the wheel back off because we got to put the cap back on, and it won't go on with the wheel. All right, now with the wheel off, we can put our cap back on. Just snap that back in, like so, on there nice and tight. And now we can throw the wheel back on, put your lug nuts back on, and you're all finished. Very simple. It's really not that hard to change some of those components like that. So don't be afraid to get your hands dirty and learn some of this stuff. If you like the video, guys, I have some more coming along. Check out the channel, subscribe and like, and we'll catch you on the next video. I appreciate it.